The Work and Pensions Secretary, Amber Rudd, has announced further changes to the rollout of universal credit, saying the benefit system needs to be more compassionate. But her department has been dealt a blow at the High Court in a case brought by 4 claimants. 1,000 jobs, more than half the workforce, are under threat at the Ford engine plant at Bridgend as part of a major restructuring of the company. The government has been urged to drop the date of Brexit from legislation if MPs reject Theresa May's deal next week. A British cybercriminal who carried out an attack so powerful it knocked an entire nation offline has been jailed. And leading tennis players have been offering their support to Andy Murray, who's announced he's to retire because of injury. The Work and Pensions Secretary, Amber Rudd, has attempted to revamp the government's flagship benefit reform, universal credit, but has found herself being told by the High Court to make further changes because some claimants are facing financial hardship. Universal credit merges 6 benefits into one and is intended to make the welfare system simpler, but critics say it has increased poverty and homelessness. Ms Rudd acknowledged that nearly 6 years after it was first trialled, the benefit still had significant shortcomings.
It is inevitable that as we roll it out, as we make the changes, we are learning about how to do it better. And maybe things that were proposed previously weren't effective or weren't compassionate in a way that I want them to be. So I'm going to be perfectly bold about making those changes where I need to.
At the same time that Amber Rudd was setting out her reforms, the High Court was finding fault with other aspects of the way universal credit is being implemented. It ruled in favour of 4 working single mothers who had argued that fluctuations in the way the benefit is paid were penalising them financially. From the court, our correspondent Andy Moore reports.
In November, 4 women went to the High Court, arguing there was a fundamental problem with the way their benefits were paid. They said they were losing hundreds of pounds a year and experiencing real problems because variations in when their salary was paid meant big differences in their monthly benefits. For example, if a claimant was paid their salary early because of a bank holiday, the system regarded them as having been paid twice in 1 month, and their universal credit payments were vastly reduced. Some of them had to go to food banks to survive. Today, 2 High Court judges said the Department for Work and Pensions had wrongly interpreted its own guidelines, adding that some of its decisions were odd in the extreme and could lead to nonsensical situations. Lawyers for the 4 women said this was a test case that would affect tens of thousands of other claimants. Carla Clark is a solicitor with a Child Poverty Action Group and represented 3 of the women. She said she hoped Amber Rudd would now swiftly change the guidelines.
We've had Amber Rudd on speaking earlier today about how she wants to ensure that the benefit system and UC is compassionate and that it's reasonable. So, if she's true to her word about reasonableness and about compassionateness, then hopefully DWP will not be appealing this ruling, but will be applying it in its fullness.
In evidence to the court last year, the DWP said it would cost hundreds of millions of pounds to correct this issue. Leaked documents seen by the BBC in October showed officials discussing it, but concluding there was nothing they could do to mitigate the problem. A spokesman for the DWP said the department was now carefully considering the court's judgment and that it was too early to say whether it would appeal.
Our social affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan, now considers what today's developments mean for the future of universal credit and how Amber Rudd's approach to the policy differs from that of her predecessors.
Since Ian Duncan Smith resigned in 2015, the Department for Work and Pensions has had 5 different Secretaries of State, but Amber Rudd is the first of them to try to put her own stamp on welfare reform rather than simply managing the system. Today's speech was billed as a reset of universal credit, with Ms Rudd acknowledging that improvements were needed. Private landlords will get the ability to request that rents are paid directly to them rather than to claimants, an issue that has seen some refuse to house tenants on universal credit. A plan to cut tax credits for families with more than 2 children will not go ahead as planned, and claimants who struggle to budget with monthly payments will be offered their money more frequently. Amber Rudd said her ambition was to create a system that was both fair and compassionate.
A standard offer cannot work for everyone. People's work patterns, the pressures they face, their families, everyone's circumstances are unique. I want to make sure universal credit has enough flexibility to adapt to personal circumstances, particularly the needs of the most vulnerable.
Universal credit is 6.5 years behind schedule and is more costly than the legacy system it is replacing. While it works for most claimants, for a significant minority, those with mental health issues or perhaps chaotic personal circumstances, the new benefit has led to an increase in the use of food banks, rent arrears and even evictions. A reform that was widely welcomed in principle in 2010 has rapidly run out of friends, as MPs and charities in particular have increasingly highlighted its serious and ongoing problems. Today's changes and the High Court decision will add more to the costs of universal credit, but Amber Rudd's judgment seems to be that this hugely troubled benefit simply has to work. Putting her own stamp on welfare reform also means taking full responsibility for whether it is judged a success.
Around 1,000 jobs are under threat at Ford's plant in Bridgend in South Wales due to restructuring plans. The car giant announced yesterday it would be reorganising its European operations but gave no details about possible cuts in the UK. The union Unite said it had now been briefed by bosses and more than half of the Bridgend workforce was likely to go by 2021. Our business correspondent Theo Leggett reports.
Ford's Bridgend plant is facing a bleak future. It needs to attract new work, but insiders say in the climate of uncertainty created by Brexit, that's looking like an uphill struggle. It currently has 2 major production lines, building small petrol engines for use in its own cars and larger ones on behalf of Jaguar Land Rover. But both programmes are due to end within the next 2 years. The factory has begun making a brand new engine design for use in small cars, but it will only be built in relatively limited quantities, leaving a large amount of surplus capacity. The company's told union representatives that as part of a major restructuring of its European operations, it plans to cut 1,000 jobs at the factory, which currently employs 1,700 people. The proposed cuts are expected to take place in 2 stages over the next 2 years. The union Unite said they would come as a devastating blow for its members and their families, with grave implications for the Welsh economy and the supply chain. The news comes at a time when the car industry in Europe as a whole is under pressure due to falling sales, declining demand for diesel and a slowdown in China, one of its key export markets.
The former Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, has made a further attempt to stop the UK from leaving the EU without a deal by urging Theresa May to delay Brexit if her withdrawal agreement is rejected by MPs next week. Mr Grieve, who backs calls for another referendum, said the government should remove the date of Brexit from UK legislation and ask the EU to extend the deadline for Britain's departure. But Mrs May's spokesman dismissed the suggestion, saying the government would not request more time. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
Dominic Grieve's views matter because he has succeeded in leading rebellions against his own Conservative government on Brexit. This week, he reduced the time the Prime Minister has to respond to a defeat on her deal from 3 weeks to just 3 days. If Theresa May fails to get enough support for that deal next week, Mr Grieve has said the date the UK is due to leave the EU, March the 29th, should be taken out of domestic legislation. The government should, in his view, explore extending Article 50, which would delay the UK's departure from the European Union. This would give MPs time to come up with an alternative deal or pursue his preferred option of another referendum. If Mrs May were unwilling to do this, then the former Attorney General believes she'd lose some ministers who oppose no deal from her government.
If cabinet ministers feel that the government is doing something that they can't accept, then it's probably their duty to resign. If you can't take a collective decision to do something, you shouldn't remain in government. It's a very important principle. So my feeling is that this will have its own dynamic.
Now, this scenario may bolster Jeremy Hunt's argument. Speaking on the Today programme, the Foreign Secretary warned Leave-supporting MPs that unless they back Theresa May's deal next Tuesday, then the parliamentary door may be open to those who are seeking to frustrate Brexit.
What we may end up with is not a different type of Brexit, but Brexit paralysis. And Brexit paralysis ultimately could lead to no Brexit. And what I'm saying is this would be incredibly damaging for that breach of trust.
5 days away from the crucial vote on the Prime Minister's deal, and there are mixed messages coming from senior Conservatives. Some ministers insist that a failure to back her will risk the UK leaving the EU without a deal. But Mr Hunt believes it's Brexit itself which is in danger.
As many as 4,000 civil servants are to be seconded from their usual work to prepare for a possible no-deal Brexit. The staff could be away from their normal jobs for more than 6 months. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford has been looking at Whitehall's preparations for Britain leaving without a deal.
Every document produced by the civil service to cover the possibility of no deal stresses that the government's priority is still to deliver on Theresa May's withdrawal agreement with the EU. But with Brexit only 11 weeks away, there's now also intense planning going on in Whitehall for a no-deal exit. Up to 4,000 civil servants will be moved within their departments or to completely different departments, such as the HMRC and DEFRA, that have to prepare for wholesale change if there's not to be a transition period. The Ministry of Defence will provide the largest number of staff, along with the Ministry of Justice, the Department for International Development, the Department for Work and Pensions, and the Department for Education. The Times newspaper obtained an email from the Permanent Secretary at the Education Department, Jonathan Slater, telling staff that while it was important that key services in the department should continue to operate, work in other areas could be mothballed. He wrote of the vital work that needs to be done now to minimise the consequences of a no-deal exit. The Department of Health has signed 2 contracts, with a third in the pipeline, for £10 million worth of warehouse storage for medicines. £1 million worth of that is for refrigerated storage.
A British computer hacker, described by the National Crime Agency as perhaps the most significant cybercriminal yet caught in the UK, has been jailed for 32 months. Daniel Kay is thought to be the first person to knock an entire nation offline after his attack on an African phone company caused the internet to crash across Liberia. Our Home Affairs correspondent Dominic Grieve was at the hearing at Blackfriars Crown Court in London.
Daniel Kay was a cyber gun for hire. The self-taught hacking expert from Egham in Surrey offered his services to the highest bidder in hidden parts of the internet. And in 2015, someone working for a rival to Liberia's then leading mobile phone company asked Kay if he could take it down. For $10,000 a month, Kay built a cyber weapon that took control of up to 1 million web cameras around the world, and he then commanded them to fire billions of data requests at Lone Star Cell. The so-called botnet jammed Lone Star's network week after week, sending angry customers running to the rival. But in November 2016, the attack ran out of control. As Kay's onslaught completely crashed Lone Star, it also took down Liberia's entire internet. A major investigation involving the FBI and the UK's National Crime Agency finally identified Kay as the culprit. Mike Hewlett, the agency's head of cybercrime, welcomed Kay's sentence of 32 months.
I regard Daniel Kay as one of the most significant cyber criminals that's been arrested in the UK. He has a significant level of skill. The attacks that he's carried out are not victimless. It's cost the companies concerned tens of millions of dollars in lost revenue and in cleaning up the effects of his attack.
The court heard Kay has received lucrative job offers from cyber security firms who want to turn him from poacher to gamekeeper, but he remains under investigation, with the FBI now considering whether Kay is responsible for hundreds of other attacks worldwide.
The family of a 9-year-old girl who died from an asthma attack in 2013 have been given permission to apply for a fresh inquest. Ella Kissi-Debrah lived near one of South London's busiest and most polluted roads, which some experts believe contributed to her death. The Attorney General said there was enough new evidence to merit reopening the inquest process. More details from our environment correspondent, Claire Marshall.
Ella was a healthy baby, but as she got older, she developed acute breathing problems.
I'm going home today.
She was taken to hospital almost 30 times in the 3 years before she suffered a fatal asthma attack. Her home was just 25 metres from London's South Circular. She was breathing air so polluted that it often broke legal limits. Her mother, Rosamond Kissi-Debrah, regularly walked Ella to school. She has been campaigning for illegal air pollution to be put on her daughter's death certificate, and today she is a big step closer. In a rare move, the Attorney General has looked at Ella's case and will allow an application for the inquest to be reopened. Her mother is delighted.
It's great and it's the right decision, and now we can get to the bottom really of the health impacts of air pollution on young people.
Key to this decision was new medical evidence that linked the harmful particles and chemicals in exhaust fumes directly to Ella's death. An expert report said that without unlawful levels of air pollution, there was a real prospect that Ella would not have died. The human rights lawyer Jocelyn Coburn represents the family.
For me, this case gives an opportunity for those people in public office who are responsible for protecting our health and for providing clean air to be asked questions, to be held to account.
It's now down to the High Court to make the final decision on whether to order a new inquest.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. The main news so far, the Work and Pensions Secretary Amber Rudd has announced more changes to the government's controversial universal credit system. But the High Court has told her to make further improvements after a case brought by claimants. Union leaders have promised to fight plans for up to 1,000 job losses at the Ford plant at Bridgend. And still to come.
When we as disabled actors start getting the same opportunities to play non-disabled roles, maybe we'll consider piping down about non-disabled actors playing disabled roles.
Actors join the debate over the portrayal of disability in film and theatre. Andy Murray has received numerous supportive messages in response to his announcement that he's to retire from professional tennis. The former world number one told a news conference in Melbourne that he was still in significant pain following hip surgery a year ago and might not be able to carry on after next week's Australian Open. An emotional Murray said that ideally he'd like to be able to keep on playing until Wimbledon this summer.
I said to my team, look, I think I can kind of get through this until Wimbledon. That is where I would like to. That's where I would like to stop playing. But I'm also not certain I'm able to do that.
Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss looks back on Murray's career and one of his greatest moments, his first victory at Wimbledon in 2013.
Murray serves. Here it is. Forehand from Murray, backhand from Djokovic. Murray's the Wimbledon champion. It seems ludicrous to say it.
6-4, 7-5.
But a British man has just won Wimbledon.
If that sense of glorious disbelief may have slightly faded, it's only because we've become used to his brilliance. Before Andy Murray, British tennis had become a sporting punchline, a byword for plucky failure, and so the first of his 2 Wimbledon titles, ending the country's 77-year wait for a men's champion, will always be his defining moment. But it is merely the highest of a range of career peaks. He won 2 Olympic gold medals, he inspired Britain to what would have once seemed unthinkable, a Davis Cup triumph, and he did it all during arguably the toughest era of men's tennis. But the relentless physical demands have taken a dramatic toll, much to the shock of the former British women's number one, Sue Barker.
When he won the ATP finals and was ranked world number one just a couple of years ago, we were thinking, wow, now, this is a whole new era with Andy right at the top of the game. I just can't believe that we are where we are so soon. I just feel as though we've been cheated at 31. It just seems a little bit too soon and too sudden.
The breadth of tributes to Murray reflects his huge popularity. The shy, awkward teenager has become a 3-time winner of the BBC Sports Personality of the Year, a man loved for his dry humour and his integrity. Billie Jean King was among those who today praised Murray's vocal support of gender equality. "You are a champion on and off the court," she said, a fitting testament to one of the greatest that British tennis, and indeed British sport, has ever seen.
Less than a month after President Trump announced the pullout of US troops from Syria, the US military has said that it's begun the process. 2,000 American forces are part of the coalition to defeat the Islamic State group in the country, but today has seen conflicting messages from Washington on the exact nature and timing of that withdrawal, as Martin Patience reports from Beirut.
Withdrawals are always carried out amid great secrecy, although unverified reports say American forces were scaling down in one military base in northeastern Syria. But what makes this withdrawal so extraordinary is the political chaos accompanying it. Initially, President Trump declared the Islamic State group had been defeated and all American troops would be out of Syria in a month. But today, 2 conflicting messages. First, A military spokesman said that the deliberate withdrawal had started, but later officials were briefing that only equipment had been removed. The reality is that Kurdish forces, backed by the Americans, are still fighting the extremists in Syria. And critics say a US pullout could allow the militants to stage a comeback. Reports also suggest America may delay the full withdrawal until Turkey promises not to attack Kurdish forces inside the country.
The head of Japan's Olympic Committee, Tsunekazu Takeda, has been placed under formal investigation in France on corruption allegations. Mr. Takeda confirmed that he was questioned by a judge last month, but insisted he was not involved in any wrongdoing. Our sports correspondent Richard Conway reports.
The case concerning Tsunekazu Takeda dates back to 2016, when French prosecutors said they were investigating a payment of £1.8 million allegedly made by the Japanese Olympic Bidding Committee to a Singapore-based consultancy firm. That company is linked to the son of the former World Athletics chief Lamine Diack, who was a member of the International Olympic Committee when it awarded the Games to Tokyo in 2013. Mr. Diack is now the subject of a number of corruption allegations. The Japanese government has always insisted its Olympic bid was clean. But according to a French judicial source, Mr. Takeda, a former Olympian show jumper turned senior administrator, is now under formal criminal investigation. Speaking to Japanese media, he said he had cooperated with a hearing in France in December and told it there had been no improper action. However, the IOC's Ethics Commission said today it had opened a file and would continue to monitor the situation.
In the United States, a 13-year-old girl from Wisconsin who disappeared the night her parents were murdered has been found alive 3 months later. Police say Jamie Kloss had been kidnapped but managed to escape and find help. A man has been arrested. Our correspondent Jane O'Brien reports.
Thousands of volunteers joined the search for Jamie Kloss after her parents were shot dead in October at the family home in rural western Wisconsin. Yesterday afternoon, a woman was approached by the 13-year-old who asked for help. She gave a description of a man she said had held her captive, and a short time later, 21-year-old Jake Patterson was arrested in a car. He has been charged with Jamie's kidnapping and the murder of her parents, James and Denise Kloss. Police say he had no previous contact with the family, but that Jamie was the target of the attack. They believe she was held in a remote house near the town of Gordon, about an hour from her home, and said the suspect went to considerable effort to avoid detection. It's not yet clear how Jamie managed to escape. The investigation attracted national attention and a reward of $50,000 was offered for information. Local officers say they never gave up hope of finding her alive and that her relatives broke down when they were told she was safe.
A Saudi teenager who fled to Thailand from her family after publicly renouncing Islam is travelling to Canada, where she's been granted asylum. Rahaf al-Qunun gained worldwide attention when she barricaded herself into a hotel room in Bangkok to avoid deportation and used Twitter to publicise her case. Our Southeast Asia correspondent Jonathan Head reports from Bangkok.
She had originally wanted to go to Australia, which was approached by the UN to resettle her. But this evening, Rahaf al-Qunun found herself on a plane heading to Canada. She was seen being escorted to the aircraft by UN staff. The UN usually approaches only one country at a time to seek asylum. It isn't clear why it switched to Canada, but given the concerns over Ms al-Qunun's safety following online threats to her life, it may be that Canada was able to process her application more quickly. So a saga that began with her videos and social media messages pleading for help from an airport transit hotel on Sunday has ended with the young Saudi woman en route to a new home. The Thai immigration chief described her as cheerful as she left. He said her father and brother, who came to Bangkok to try to persuade her to come back with them, are also shortly leaving Thailand. She had refused to see them after renouncing Islam and accusing her family of abusing her.
One of the UK's leading cancer experts has died suddenly after receiving a yellow fever vaccine designed to protect against the mosquito-borne infection. Professor Martin Gore, who was 67, had worked at the Royal Marsden NHS Foundation Trust for more than 30 years. Here's our health correspondent, Dominic Hughes.
Martin Gore, a highly respected professor at the Institute of Cancer Research, is understood to have received the yellow fever vaccine shortly before he died. What's not known is whether he had any underlying health conditions that may have contributed to his death. Experts warn that not everything that happens after a vaccine is administered can be attributed to the vaccine. NHS advice says serious reactions to the yellow fever inoculation, which can affect the brain and organs, occur in fewer than 10 in a million doses. That's much lower than the annual risk of dying in a road traffic accident in the UK, for example. But the risks of complications can be higher in the over 60s as well as young babies. Professor Gore's colleagues have expressed great sadness after his death. He'd published more than 550 articles and edited 10 textbooks, and has been described as a giant in his field, a compassionate and generous man, and a true expert with encyclopedic knowledge.
Thousands of overseas sellers have been banned from Amazon and eBay for not charging VAT to their British customers. Most have to levy the 20% tax on consumers, regardless of whether they're sending them goods from abroad or dispatching them from a warehouse in the UK. Online marketplaces are now required by law to check that the overseas sellers are complying, as our personal finance correspondent Simon Gompertz explains.
The list of goods regularly sold without VAT includes hairbrushes, fake eyelashes, salt and pepper grinders, computer keyboards, umbrellas and flags. UK suppliers were up in arms about the unfair competition, much of which they said was coming from China. HMRC's response just over 2 years ago was to make online marketplaces jointly liable with the sellers for 20% sales tax. More recently, 7 online retailers, including Amazon, eBay, Etsy and ASOS, agreed they'd remove sellers from their sites if Revenue and Customs issued a red flag notice to say they weren't complying. Since then, the number of forced removals has rocketed. HMRC says 4,600 sellers have been red flagged. That doesn't include a greater number that have been taken off by the websites themselves before receiving a warning. The number of sellers self-registering for VAT has gone up rapidly too, with £200 million extra tax collected.
In the city, the 100 share index ended the day 25 points lower at 6,918. On Wall Street a short time ago, the Dow Jones was down 70 points at 23,932. On the currency markets, the pound was up 0.6% against the dollar at $1.28.3, and against the euro, sterling was up 0.9% at €1.11.9, making a euro worth 89.4 pence. One of Britain's most eminent actors, Simon Callow, has weighed into the debate about whether able-bodied actors should play disabled characters. Bryan Cranston has become the latest star to face criticism for accepting the role of a quadriplegic man. In a letter to The Times, Simon Callow suggested, with some irony, that he should withdraw from his one-man show of A Christmas Carol, as Charlotte Gallagher reports.
What, don't your arms work?
They don't.
You can move your mouth.
As can you. I need assistance.
Bryan Cranston defended his decision to play a wheelchair-bound character in The Upside by saying that actors were always asked to play other people. He also compared it to him playing a gay man. It's not the first time able-bodied actors have been criticised for taking on such roles. When the BBC announced that Charlie Heaton would be playing Joseph Merrick in The Elephant Man, the disability charity Scope said a massive pool of disabled talent had been overlooked. In a somewhat sarcastic letter to The Times, Simon Callow said he was in terrible trouble, as he'd been playing 37 characters in his one-man production of A Christmas Carol, including women and, in his words, heaven help me, Tiny Tim. But actors with disabilities say they hardly get any opportunities. Melissa John stars in Coronation Street and says the industry has to change.
When we as disabled actors start getting the same opportunities to play non-disabled roles, maybe we'll consider piping down about non-disabled actors playing disabled roles. But until that point, we have to be able to keep fighting for our place. You know, as disabled people, we make up almost 20% of the population. That's already not really represented anywhere in the media. If you're going to tell our stories, at least give us a shot of being able to tell them ourselves.
And there's no shortage of actors with disabilities looking for parts. Last year, around 750 people auditioned for Hollywood's first ever open casting call for disabled actors.
The headlines again. The High Court has ruled in favour of 4 women who argued that the way universal credit is being implemented is unfair and causing them financial hardship. Earlier, the Work and Pensions Secretary Amber Rudd had announced further changes intended to make the welfare system more effective and compassionate. Unions say a Europe-wide restructuring announced by Ford yesterday will result in 1,000 job losses at its plant in South Wales. The high-profile Conservative backbencher Dominic Grieve has called for the UK's departure from the EU to be delayed if Theresa May's Brexit deal is rejected by MPs next week. And some of tennis's biggest stars have offered Andy Murray messages of sympathy, support and praise after he announced he would retire this year because of injury. BBC News.